Hi, welcome, and thank you everyone who is here to join us in what we hope is an invigorating conversation about the road to Baku and COP29 and what may come thereafter. Just want to briefly introduce New America's Planetary Politics Initiative. This is a call to action for reimagining a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable global order. As our world becomes increasingly hotter, wetter, and more complex, the time to build new global institutions attuned to today's environment in preparation for tomorrow is now. I'm Martha Mulfetis. I'm a senior fellow here at New America within the Planetary Politics Initiative, working on just energy transition. And I'm also a visiting assistant professor at the Pratt Institute's Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment, where I teach environmental economics. I've spent the last 15 years helping NGOs, think tanks, and businesses unpack a lot of the big climate, environmental justice, resource conflict, and sustainable development questions and issues that shape their work as a senior climate and energy policy consultant. Dubai's COP28 is a unique moment. It put us on a path towards net zero in real global, agreement terms, with the call to triple renewables and phase out fossil fuels. That was last year. This year, the annual conference of the parties is going to be in Baku, and COP29 will be focusing on something called a new collective quantified goal, or NCQG, because we need more acronyms in this space. This will be focused on climate finance. It'll replace that $100 billion goal, so it's kind of a big deal. The $100 billion goal came out in Copenhagen in 2009. The world's very different today. But one of the other kind of things that COP29 will also shine a very small light on are questions around technology transfers and some other very small elements and details that could help nations bring together a more robust second round of nationally determined contributions, which will be due early next year. Just a week and a half ago, the UN agreed to a pact for the future during the UN General Assembly, and this specifically underscored the need to reform climate and development finance. So there's clearly a big spotlight on this question of climate finance and development finance. And these details that are going to get hashed out in Baku will help shape future COP30 outcomes and beyond. So none of these things exist in a vacuum. And today I have the pleasure of talking with diverse climate and energy transition experts on Mahatma Gandhi's birthday of all days. A small reminder that one person can make a big world of difference. I'm joined with Camilla Bourne, who is a climate diplomacy expert and former co-organizer of COP26 in Glasgow. Kaushik Deb, who is the executive director for India at the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, or EPIC, because their work is epic. And Laura Kelly, who's the director of Shaping Sustainable Markets at the International Institute for Environment and Development, also known as the IIED. I want to give everyone a moment to share a little bit about themselves. So maybe Camilla, we can start with you.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much, Martha. Yes, so I've worked in international climate and energy for too long, and not only looking at what happens at that kind of macro international level, but also thinking through the political economy of that reality on the ground. So we all know that the international conversation is a sum of its parts. It's a sum of everything that happens in every economy and every society. So brokering the gap between those two things is something I'm very passionate about, which becomes even more important now when we're in transition phase, not just putting targets on the table, but also working out how do we work together to deliver the transition that we want to achieve.
Great. Kaushik?
Thanks, Martha. And thanks, everyone. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Having kind of spent the last 25 odd years doing a whole variety of things in the developmental space, particularly now for the last 15, 16 years, focusing on oil and gas and fossil fuels, but more particularly now, the role that these fuels play in the energy transition, especially in the developing world, and what kind of choices exist, especially given the urgency for action at this point in time, as well as the numerous and humongous other developmental needs that parts of the developing world are still yet to overcome and grapple with. Trying to kind of get a sense of what are the policy choices that would make sense in this kind of energy transition is really what I focus on and what my research is on. And hopefully, that's the perspective that I'll be able to bring to the conversation today.
Great. Laura, last but not least.
Thank you, Martha. Hi, everyone. Really nice to be joining this discussion today. As Martha said, I'm currently at the International Institute for Environment and Development, but I would call myself somebody who's been a strong and hopefully enthusiastic supporter of more sustainable, just outcomes on climate development and nature across my career. I've worked in the UK government's Department for International Development. I've worked in the NGO sector. And I think over those sort of 15 to 20 years, I've really seen the need to bring these agendas together much more closely. We're getting very siloed. And here in my research group at IID, we've got work on food systems, looking at climate resilient food systems. We've also got work on energy access, not just mitigation and clean energy, but for the millions of people, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa, who don't even have access to energy. Also work on critical minerals. We're seeing that as a key part of the energy transition, and climate finance. Innovative sources. We know we need more than domestic resources and traditional aid will deliver. So how do we leverage those new resources? That's really important to us. And yeah, I think in terms of COP, these things are all sort of coming together this year. As you said, climate and development finance needs to come together. So yes, we're looking forward to this discussion.
That sounds great. I have like an open question for everybody. COPs are where it's difficult, right? Because all nations agree to certain climate targets, and it's this kind of global temperature check on where the appetite is for climate action. And this has been a kind of unique year with global elections, elections from within Europe to India, South Africa, and now the US election is looming. In what ways will these political seat changes affect COP29 outcomes for better or worse? Whoever wants to go first is welcome to chime in.
So if I can kind of try and bring a perspective, the Indian election exercise is supposed to be the world's largest exercise in democracy, just by the sheer number of people who end up voting. And this year was also particularly momentous. But I think sometimes as economists or statisticians or just geeks, we end up focusing very much on numbers and not necessarily what they actually mean. So all of these things that came out, all of these numbers that came out over the last quarter of 2023, that 60% of the world or 70% of the world will be going through some form of democratic exercise in 2024, and that will mean kind of hugely many important decisions to be made in all of these important countries around the world. But if you kind of work through what countries have gone through elections this year and kind of the electoral outcomes, they aren't really those kind of dramatic sea changes that one would have expected had the exercise been that contentious or contested. Without kind of naming names, I mean, there are parts of the world where you did know who's going to win with a 97% positive turnout. And that really isn't kind of something that signals very much in terms of risks for any kind of policy outcomes on climate or for that matter, anything else. Earlier this year, there was a conference in New York where one of the politicians from the ruling BJP party in India was kind of asked this question. So what do you think will be the outcome of the election? And the gentleman was kind enough to turn around and say that, hey, this is a problem for you Americans, not for us Indians.
Laura or Camilla, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Perhaps I could pick up from, I think, some of what we're seeing in Europe. Just yesterday, the results of the Austrian election were announced, and we saw a big surge in the far right support, but again on quite a low turnout, and a percentage made them the largest party, but still a minority party. And I think we're seeing in many more right-wing administrations a rowing back of commitments on climate change, but also in difficult economic circumstances, more resources being diverted into sort of social spending. In the UK, we've had an election which actually went in the other direction, but I think we're yet to see any real change in the government's position. We're really hopeful, those of us that are working here, that the kinds of things that the government talked about in opposition will come through. And I think what is interesting is while we're having all of these changes at the national level, and it's actually the US that I've heard this example from, that the state of California, it's equivalent size to the world's sixth largest economy. They've actually got a lot of really good policies that are in place and embedded. So it's not just what's happening in national elections; it's actually what's happening at the regional, the local level across a whole range of countries. And I imagine some of that's the same in India as well.
Yeah. Mila, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, so I mean, surprise, surprise, the US election is going to loom very large, as it will have just happened before the COP. And I think that if we have a Trump 2 scenario, I think there'll be a bit of a chilling on the conversation, and we should be ready for that. In a way, it will focus minds and mean that countries have to draw a line in the sand about where they stand, and in a way that's quite helpful rather than letting it drift. But of course, it will color things under a Harris scenario. I imagine that it won't be a huge cause for celebration, but more as a kind of continuation of business as usual. And in any case, as Laura also already spoke about, because of the slew of donor countries having elections, some which will have elections, there's a lot of uncertainty about the availability of finance, and that's going to make it quite challenging to conclude the negotiations on the new collective quantified goal when there's so much uncertainty about where budgets are going to be. The last thing I'd say, though, is that absolutely these elections are having an impact, but I do think that we're moving on and beyond an idea of climate as a sort of ideological concept in many spaces. This is something with which we're building modern and effective economies on, and there are many different motivations and interests that are calling for this kind of economy, if that's for autarky, or if that's for revenue, or if that's for modernity and more efficiency and cost. There's a load of different motivations, and this isn't just a nice to have, do it as a soft, cuddly left thing. Absolutely not. There's all sorts of motivations for why you would do this transition, and I think we have to continue to ride all of those waves, whatever happens in whichever election.
Such good points all around. This is something that comes up a lot, is like we have to kind of code switch a little and talk about not just why it's like a morally good thing to do, but why it's economically beneficial and can be like a big boon to whoever jumps on board sooner rather than later. The UNGA just wrapped up. We have this new Pact for the Future. It was not signed by all parties, but it was agreed to by consensus. And there was some backlash from some countries. And it was kind of quite a reminder of the COP process. Like annually, there's usually some backlash. There's usually some pushback. If you can think of a country who would not like multilateralism to thrive, which do you think it would be? And what do you think their goals may be? Just like whoever wants to chime in, feel free to unmute.
I'll go first, as I was last time. I mean, I think so. It's a fair assessment that a lot of multilateralism and the nature of it has been shaped by Western influence. And we do live in a multipolar world now, which doesn't necessarily fully have the level of representation that is needed in all the institutions. And that was something that was very encouraging about what came through in the Pact for the Future, talking about the need for that kind of institutional reform to better reflect those different ideas. But I can have appreciation and sympathy for some who don't see themselves in the current system having some cause for things not going so well. I think there are also some malign actors who are more interested in chaos than cohesion, and I imagine you can all imagine them in your mind's eye. I don't think I have to spell that out for you, but you can imagine that they may benefit from that state of the situation. So when we're having a conversation in the UNFCCC about COPs, we are having a conversation which is about climate, but we are also having a conversation about multilateralism. And there are a few actors who are in support of chaos reigning.
Yeah. Laura or Kaushik?
I can pick that up, sort of perhaps extending that theme that Camilla mentioned around sort of equity of participation. And I think for many low-income countries, small island states, the least developed country group, they should have more say and more impact. There's a lot of initiatives to support them in that. So that more equitable discussion is something that we do need to move to. We need the sort of the reform of the international systems to support that. And I think I'd sort of support what Camilla said about sort of benign actors wanting to have chaos reign. But I think the majority of countries, the block against that is actually quite strong. So even those countries that do want to be difficult, they're not necessarily making alliances and allegiances, and that's how these things move forward, when we can create alliances and allegiances of countries and actors that do want to move forward.
Yeah, Kaushik?
So I think that's a very interesting point that Laura just made, and so I have three things to say here. I mean, multilateralism is good for its own sake, but we have to also remind ourselves that most international agreements come together when some of the major actors get together and decide to do things towards a common purpose. Fun fact, I had given up on the COP process. In fact, last year was the first COP I attended in about 15 years. I mean, the last COP that I'd done before this was at Durban. And that's where this new interesting idea started to float, that if the US and China were to align on what climate goals that they were going to pursue and pursue jointly, they could be a positive global outcome. And to me, I think that was the most important determinant for Paris. And really the first time we saw the COP process after Kyoto actually achieve something. And that, I think, is an important factor to remember, that multilateralism does not necessarily mean that all of the 197 UN state actors all come together at the same time and sign up to the same playbook. The second part to this is also that there are a number of activities outside the COP or the UN process which have a very substantial impact. The International Solar Alliance is one great example here. The activities that sometimes you manage to pursue through G20 are another example. And having these somewhat large and influential coalitions do things, I think, is also a very important part of trying to solve something as complex as climate. Just the fact that it's a global problem. And finally, there is also a very strong now, I think, change in the system, in the process of how we think about important countries in the world. And to all intents and purposes, the most important countries in the world for the 1980s are not the ones that form that subset today. If you have an economy which is declining by 4 or 5% per annum, the population growth rate which is clearly negative, Your entire influence depends on hacking elections and sending troops across the border to neighboring countries. You aren't really the most important actor who one needs to engage with on a issue such as climate, perhaps, which, as Camilla was saying, is really an opportunity to develop a future-proof, forward-looking green economy that allows for growth and prosperity without us all, going back to living as we were in the Middle Ages.
Such great points all around. Appreciate your unique perspectives. After what's now 14, likely going on 15 consecutive months above 1.5 C, thanks to that El Nino push, we're all seeing like a window into what 1.5 C might feel like if, without the El Nino push. And it's really no longer news that climate change is here. We all have common but differentiated climate impacts, and we have common but differentiated responsibilities, of course, within the COP frameworks. Do you think the 1.5 C goal is gone? And do you see this kind of ever-present climate crisis that we're experiencing right now? Like, will this be a moment that will spur on robust actions at COP29 and beyond? Same format. Whoever wants to start the conversation is welcome.
So, I mean, Martha, that's not really how I think about it. Because kind of if that was really the lens that I took, I'd really be very depressed all the time. It's kind of hard to imagine that this really impossible target is something that we are all kind of setting ourselves up for. And the way we are today, we're really setting ourselves up for failure because it just seems so hard. And the fact that it's already here. It's like, when you were in high school and you had to kind of prepare for exams and you suddenly realize that you were up for your math test tomorrow, even though you thought that it was like 6 months away and you had all the time in the world. The first World Energy Outlook that I ever reviewed was, I think, in 2011 or 2012, where the tagline was the golden age of gas. The important thing in that I kind of took away is that the energy consumption and the fossil fuel consumption and emissions trajectory was something that would have gotten us close to about 3.5 C version of the world. The last energy outlook that came out autumn last year has an emissions and a fossil fuel consumption trajectory that takes us to about 2.6. So clearly we are getting something right? And there is progress being made. Now, of course, kind of it's not happening as rapidly as we'd like it to. And that's really a question of scale and speed. A whole variety of factors kind of go into that. You can kind of get into the weeds there, supply chain issues, being able to access all of the materials that you need to do that, to be able to do all of that sustainably, etc. But it's something that we kind of now recognize as a problem that we can solve, whether it's technology or finance or deployment. And now it's kind of a question of being able to do that rapidly enough. And seeing what progress we've made for the last 10, 12 years, I'm kind of, and what I like to call myself as a cautiously optimistic person, that we'll kind of get to a version of the world where, as said, not many of us are suffering the ravages as we did during the dark ages.
Oh, fair points.
Perhaps I could pick up on that. I think that is actually a really good point to make, that we have made progress in ways that we probably think we wouldn't. Here in the UK, just this week, the last coal-fired power station has been closed down. So we're getting an increasing amount of our energy from renewable sources. We're still getting quite a lot of it from natural gas, but we are moving in the right direction. I think this highlights the fact that the technologies are there, but it's about having broader access to them. And it's not just a sort of a traditional north-south transfer of technology. China, and I think even India, is developing a range of technologies that could help some of the countries that in the global south need to move away to green their economies. So oil-producing countries like Nigeria or Angola. It's not just about the technology, it's about alternative development sources. And that's where some of the issues around the critical minerals, cobalt from the DRC, for example, that we also, in this kind of need to share and develop technologies and make them locally appropriate, we also need to think about what the implications are. We don't want another sort of Dutch disease type or environmental degradation as a result of wholesale rush for critical minerals. So I think there's a lot to be optimistic about around keeping to 1.5, but we also need to think about what some of the challenges might be and learn from our experience so far.
Camilla, any thoughts?
I'm afraid I didn't hear the question because my internet dropped out. So if you could recap the question, then I can give you some thoughts.
So my question was just, linking back to the, the rally that we're in this 14 consecutive months at or above 1.5C, thanks to that El Nino push. So we're like getting a window into what a 1.5C world would feel like. Do you think the 1.5C goal is gone? And do you think our ever-present climate reality will spur on more robust actions at COP29 and beyond?
So I've always thought of 1.5 degrees as two things. One is a scientific target, which is informed by science, and there's an absolute component to that. And also as a values-based diplomatic choice about the kind of world we want to build towards and the kind of world we want to collaborate for. And I think that in any case, the second one doesn't and shouldn't go away. And you could think about that in terms of preserving human rights everywhere in the world. It doesn't happen every day. Okay, it doesn't fit into the same physics category, and I appreciate that. But nonetheless, it's still a value that you want to uphold. And that enshrined in that set of values is a choice about who you want to protect, how you want to protect, how you want to work together to make things better. So no, I don't think it's gone. And I definitely think that the urgency of the extreme weather that we've seen definitely is shaping things. And I think that is further embedding the reality of the transition into economies. I think there is more to be done on the adaptation side of things. And I think that is starting to shift. We've often thought in the international space about adaptation as an issue for people over there. I say that as a white European person, but actually adaptation is an issue for everyone, and we are all behind, and we need to scale the technologies, the investments, the choices everywhere about what we're going to do. And we need to ensure that the most vulnerable are protected within countries and externally to be able to protect people as best as possible. I do think it is shaping things. I think things are different than they were when Fridays for the Future was really rallied. And at that point, I think that the sort of emotional relationship with the climate impacts was shaping the politics a lot more. But the reality is, although last week I was at New York Climate Week and I was really encouraged actually about what was going on, because in private meetings, there's some really radical and courageous work that's happening that wouldn't have been happening a year, 2 years, 5 years ago. Leaders were not present on this topic, but understandably, they are very distracted by current conflicts that are ongoing, and that is understandable. So how do we web through the alchemy of working through that need for political leadership on these topics, but also ride these economic and societal waves, acknowledging that we know that we're storing up more pain if we don't move more quickly?
Yeah, really good points all around. But totally agree. I mean, Climate Week was so interesting. Things that were kind of provocative comments that happened on side events and the like at past Climate Weeks, or even just at the World Makes Spring meetings, which was not that long ago. They're part of the conversation now, these questions of equitable finance. And then, when you have the one-on-ones with folks, it's even more provocative than whatever was being discussed openly. So I think there's definitely a call for equity and justice, and just the reality that there are such disproportionate, a lot of disproportion on the scales of influence and action. A question for you, Camilla, with your background, being within the climate diplomacy space and all these different COP apparatuses. Is there anything new that could happen at Baku that didn't happen at Dubai, or is this going to be a stepping stone to Brazil and future NDCs?
So number one, we have the big thing on the agenda, which is the new finance goal. And it wasn't on the agenda before. So now it's on the agenda and now it has to be agreed. So that's a new thing that is going to come from COP29, although we may see the varying degrees of agreement on that. And I think there you're really putting in the frame a challenge around, you know, we know that the Paris Agreement moved to a more universal system where, of course, those who had more capacity and capability to do so did more, and those with more historic responsibility did more, sticking to that principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. It's like a tongue twister for you all, CBDRRC. But I think now we're having this conversation about the money implications of that is putting that further into the spotlight. The challenge is that with all the elections looming, we haven't had the same kind of political attention put on this because this is a big political shift. And I'm not sure that we've done all the homework that is needed to really get that across the line. So it's going to be very interesting to see how those outcomes manifest and if things will get left for later and how far we can get with it. The second thing that I think might happen with COP29 is that it's going to be smaller. And I think we need to have smaller COPs more often. I think it is very helpful to have the sort of trade fair, the circus, the space where all the different climate related actors can come together and they can network and get things done together and forge partnerships and all these things. But COPs have got pretty unwieldy, and also the negotiations are becoming less, there's less to do. There's important sort of hygiene factors and keeping on top of things and checking in on the monitoring, review and verification and all that kind of stuff. But I think having the option of smaller COPs as well as potentially bigger ones at different moments is really helpful. So I'm kind of encouraged by the idea that less people will be there. I think that's partly why New York Climate Week had more of a bounce in it, because I think a lot of people went to that instead. And I actually think that worked very well. And I hope that there'll be a little bit more diversification around. It doesn't have to be a huge COP every time. It can be, and that could be great, but it can also, these conversations can also be had in other fora as well.
Yeah. Immediately following Climate Week, I keep seeing these things about how we need to move Climate Week to not be the same week as UNGA because it's like too just mental. Kaushik, you have a well of experience in energy transition questions and addressing them. I'm curious to know what energy transition solutions are happening now that could bolster COP29, help live up to the Paris and Dubai goals, and maybe even set up, tee up more robust NDCs.
Sure. So to me, this is the second OPEC COP, or are we not allowed to call it that? I mean, just FYI, the joint ministerial meeting of OPEC ended a few hours back, deciding to keep oil production cuts at the steady level without changing them until December. So no changes on that. But it's also a very strange moment to be talking about climate and COP with everything that's kind of happening around the world, especially in the Middle East, where it seems that everything could end very, very quickly and very, very badly and very, very soon. But nevertheless, kind of coming back to the other existential crisis facing us and COP, as kind of Camilla was kind of describing 29, essentially kind of being described as labeled as the finance COP, right? So this is like one of those classic economist jokes that if you want to make anything boring, you just kind of put a bunch of finance people, accounts people, and economics people in a room, and you kind of will suck all joy and happiness out of it. But if that's really what the COP's focus is going to be, I think it's kind of going to be interesting to see how that aligns with the other two things that happened in Dubai. The two other very big commitments towards decarbonization and energy transition. One is the tripling of the renewable energy target by 2030, and the second, the tripling of nuclear electricity by 2030. Both of these are fairly big ticket expensive items. As much as costs of renewables have kind of come down over the last decade or so, the entire benefit of that has been felt and absorbed by the OECD and countries like India and China. The vast majority of the developed world hasn't really benefited from the decline in solar costs or whatever declines in wind that we've seen in the past. How do we kind of get that to happen in large parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, in Africa is going to be is going to be kind of the question that I think COP29 could try and answer. And where is the money that kind of comes in to help deliver that? These projects still remain fairly expensive and risk in many of these smaller countries. And the solution there is developmental finance. A lot of the what I would call the middle countries, countries like China and India, possibly even kind of Brazil to a great extent, don't really rely on developmental finance to meet their energy transition goals anymore. There's a fair amount of private capital, a fair amount of private OECD capital that is available to do a large amount of renewable activity in these countries. 98%, 99% of India's renewable energy capacity sits with the private sector. Fun fact, right? But that's not true for large parts of the developing world. And that's really, I think, where this translation of money into actual activity will be kind of interesting to track.
Oh, great. I think these are really touch on, the broad strokes that we're going to be keeping an eye on at COP29. Laura, when considering debt burdens and climate finance, I know this is an area you've spent a lot of time working on. Can the new NCQG, the new acronym we all get to learn, framework help better direct funding?
I think we certainly hope so. I mean, it's absolutely crazy that there are low-income countries that are currently paying out more in debt service than they're receiving in either development aid or climate finance. We did some analysis earlier this year that showed that nearly 60 of the world's poorest countries paid out a total of debt service of about 33 billion in 2022. They got just over 20 billion in climate finance back. So that's a clearly unequitable situation, and one that means they're not in a good position to meet their own climate goals in adaptation, mitigation, whatever. So I think for the NQCG, as Kaushik was just saying, for the countries that don't have access to financial markets, that don't have, or that have triple B credit ratings, that grants are going to have to be an essential part of the financial toolbox for them. Debt forgiveness also needs to happen. We've been working on this idea of sort of redesigning debt for nature swaps to sort of make debt for climate and nature swaps one of the tools, and for the debt forgiveness to be linked to countries' own climate and development priorities. So it's national adaptation plans, or it's national biodiversity action plan. So it's not about a conditional kind of debt relief. It's actually really something that helps countries meet their own goals, and that also those resources get channeled through government systems, not in sort of standalone special purpose vehicles run by external organisations. So this thing to really build capacity and give governments more agency over their resources. But critically, if you have key performance indicators, key targets that you're trying to meet, that actually it also helps accountability to the populations, because they can see what it is the government is supposed to be achieving, rather than sort of what's in a sort of very sort of untransparent and opaque sort of debt or finance agreement. So I think that's a really key aspect of what we need to see in terms of broader financial architecture reform, but the NQCG itself really trying to sort of make that distinction. And yes, it's a challenge, because some of the biggest climate mitigation impacts will come from supporting or trying to leverage more investment into more countries where there's more to be done to mitigate emissions. But it's going to be really key for those lower income countries, which are also some of the ones with challenges of climate resilience, small island developing states, for example, and actually having to face challenges around adaptation. We're seeing changes in crop yields as a result of climate vulnerability, and for low-income countries and low-income communities, that's really key. So, going back to something that Camilla said at the beginning about thinking about the economic models, it's actually how do you invest in ways that build climate resilience into your development model, and that's about bringing development and climate finance together rather than having in these sort of separate buckets.
Yeah, no, definitely important points there. And, finance really speaks to the equity dynamics too between nations. And these lending things are so like muddy once you start getting into the details. Question for everyone, but maybe we'll start with Laura, just because of your work on critical resources. With this goal to triple renewables, do you foresee critical resources to be a part of the conversation at COP29? Because it wasn't, if you do like a word search for critical resources in the Pact for the Future, it's not really there. There's a mentioning of tripling renewables, but we're not really talking about what that means when it comes to materials that we'll need.
Yes, I think again, it's this thing of how much do you load onto a COP? Camilla was just saying earlier, the whole sort of sideshow that goes along with it. But yeah, making the linkages is what's really key. There's been quite a lot of discussion around where these critical minerals are found, often in very environmentally fragile environments, or environments where local communities and indigenous peoples are sort of custodians of the environment. A couple of weeks ago, just the UN Secretary General's panel on principles for extraction of critical minerals in a sort of human rights, environmentally sustainable way came out. And that actually just set out some really quite good high level principles. And then it has an annex where it talks about things that could be done, actionable recommendations to achieve those. And I think some of those things link to some of the issues that are being discussed in COP. So that's where there's a potential read across. But it is about all of these different forums interlinking and seeing what it is that they can take forward that's within their remit, rather than trying to join everything up, because then that just becomes completely unmanageable.
Yeah. I want to give Kaushik and Camilla a chance to chime in if they have any thoughts on this question.
So not specifically from the COP perspective, but I think that it's still very early days in terms of the developmental cycle of these new industries. I mean, the way I'm going to think about this is the way the automobile industry or the oil and gas industry was in 1905 or 1910. And there is, I think, still a fairly long runway for these industries to kind of develop, mature, and hopefully become more sustainable. I would also pin this hope that having learned from our experiences with the way extractive industries have kind of happened in the past, we are able to do this in a somewhat more sensible and a strategic manner, so that the environmental sensitivities that Laura was kind of talking about are recognized and are acknowledged and dealt with. A lot of the impacts that these have on local communities, as well as on the local developmental needs, are also kind of something that does reflect as we kind of make these sectors and industries more mature, but also to be able to kind of focus more actively on reuse and recycling, so that our need for virgin materials is as little as possible. And that kind of should just make sense as a native financial incentive or economic incentive, without having to kind of create additional government instruments to make that happen. So still very early days to kind of say how far we are down this pathway and how far we would need to go, but again, cautiously optimistic.
Camilla, any thoughts?
just more a kind of public service announcement that the tricky thing about COPs is that until really recently, they never actually spoke about sort of real economy choices. So they put in place a structure in which governments could themselves think about that process. So they could think about what their emissions targets would be and what that would therefore mean for sectors. But they didn't pass comment on what that meant as a kind of global direction of travel. That has started to happen a little bit. We saw that on coal in Glasgow at COP26, and we saw that on the transition away from fossil fuels at COP28. But they are not operational. They are normative ideas, effectively, that are enshrined, which is still important because it's agreed by all those countries, but nonetheless, it is not asking anyone to do anything specifically. And yes, there may be an attempt over coming years to sort of also mention critical raw materials, but at the moment, no. And I guess the question is, where does that add value? And if you really want something to be properly negotiated, it needs to be put on the agenda way in advance and discussed. Perhaps arguably that it's actually better to be having discussions about critical raw materials in the context of regional fora or potentially the G20, although there's some holes with that too, and potentially the G7, to really think about that practical cooperation. And in general, I really feel we have to move from sort of a climate diplomacy, which is about alignment and negotiations in the UN, to a transition diplomacy, which is much more about cooperation between one another to be able to broker outcomes and actually support implementation.
If I can kind of just add to that and echo something that we were chatting about earlier, I think it's also kind of time when we start thinking of a developmental paradigm which is not what we've had in the past, despite all the previous 28 COPs or how which many kind of meetings that we've had. I think this is possibly the first time in our history as a species we are at that inflection point where we cannot truly do what we did in the past. So, for instance, if India was to follow the same developmental pathway that China did, it just won't happen. There just isn't enough of an earth for India to follow China's growth trajectory. And you know what China did following the OECD historically. So we need to kind of start thinking about growth and development in a manner where, as Camilla earlier kind of said, climate is not a nice thing to have, but it's kind of fundamental to how we have a future-proof energy transition compliant economy, which leads to prosperity and growth and employment at the same time, kind of without destroying our own futures. And doing that kind of requires us to kind of not just think about how we're going to use fossil fuels going forward, but also how we use all of these critical resources and critical minerals and all the other things that we need for the energy transition in a sustainable and a continuous fashion. So constructing a developmental trajectory which is less resource intensive, but delivers similar levels of prosperity, or at least some levels of prosperity, to the 6 odd billion people who still live in the non-OECD developing world, is the important thing. And they're kind of to have this new developmental paradigm, I don't think comes from a multilateral process. It just kind of comes from thinking that's done very, very deeply in universities and think tanks, and then applied and deployed very, very widely across the new developing world. This is, I think, why India's developmental trajectory has kind of pivoted over the last 7 or 8 years, not because India suddenly discovered that climate was a nice thing to do, but India kind of recognized the fact that if it did not do things differently, there was simply no way that it would grow and be able to add the million odd jobs that it needs to every month, a million a month, right? Not a small number. I mean, we might be thinking about some few EU countries put together at some point. And to be able to kind of do that then across parts of Africa, Latin America, the rest of South Asia is really our challenge today. And the reason why I say that is our challenge today, because if we don't get it right now, we pretty much would have lost the boat, and then a 1.5C target won't even be material.
Yeah. just want to encourage audience members to send their questions in. We'll be getting to audience questions in a moment, but just have a couple more questions for y'all. We've already talked a lot about some of these complementary frameworks that just came out naturally in our conversation. But if there, what maybe additional or alternative global frameworks or measures do you think we need to make this COP process more successful? Question for everybody. So feel free to unmute if you want to get us started.
I'll jump in briefly. I mean, so in terms of making the COP process more successful, because the COP framework of the Paris Agreement is actually being delivered, which is the real prize. I really think we have to have much better arrangements for regional cooperation. Because energy, when you're thinking about fossil fuels, can come from all parts of the world. It comes on ships, it comes through pipes. But energy, when you are electrified, is going through interconnection and is much more of a regional competency. So I really think that from the energy perspective, you need to cooperate. And also from a climate impacts perspective, that's where you're going to get the greatest solidarity, the greatest opportunity to share resources, if that is the special types of planes which put out fires, or if that is, different resources for flood management. You can really rely on your neighbors, and geography really matters in that context. So I would really support better regional cooperation for both transition and also dealing with climate impacts.
Great. Kaushik or Laura?
The thing that kind of comes to mind here is that a lot of the more successful or the more well-known or the more important cooperative or global coalitions are the ones that kind of really involve, for want of a better phrase, the more important countries. So, I mean, this is kind of setups like the G20 or the G7, or for that matter, things like security pacts like AUKUS or the Quad or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, etc. I think what we kind of do lack is some form of cooperation within the smaller developing countries that could deliver on two things. One, perhaps ability to aggregate activities and projects so that you can kind of start thinking of deploying capital at scale and not have to kind of worry about whether the credit rating of a country is good or bad, but whether being able to kind of pool this in a portfolio between the set of countries allows for improvements like that. And second, to be able to kind of also then have some heft and ability to carry a weight in these international conversations. So more regional cooperation between developing countries is, I think, kind of something that would be helpful, not necessarily something that I think is easy to do. My own region, South Asia, is a classic example where the SAARC coalition is possibly one of the most defunct cooperation organizations in the world. But certainly, if this was to kind of come together, then you are looking at a very, very strong population group cohort, as well as perhaps economic opportunity that becomes material.
Yeah, I'd agree with what my fellow panelists have said around regional cooperation, but I think things that go alongside it are also sort of the cooperation amongst the financial institutions. There's a reform process going on in the World Bank at the moment with its new now head, Ajay Banga, but still the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, all have different standards and processes that they use. So actually, particularly for those lower income countries, the challenges and the hoops they need to jump through to get access to climate finance, even if there is an ambitious NQCG agreed money, like some of that money will be distributed through the regional and regional development banks and the World Bank, and they do need to work better together.
Yeah, increasing calls for better cooperation. Love it. Hope we can get there. And while it is going to be a smaller COP, which has its own distinct advantages, there'll be so many small technical details that'll get kind of hashed out, in addition to like the big finance goal. These details could help inform national targets, and increasing ambition and for COP30 and maybe even beyond, right? If there was one thing you'd like to see out of COP29 and ahead of COP30, what would it be? Open question for everybody.
I think kind of a better definition of what we would like to see each of the countries' NDCs actually seek to deliver, and kind of so in some version of the world, what we have today is somewhat open-ended, right? Nationally determined contributions are truly nationally determined without having any need to meet a qualitative or a quantitative criteria, except that all of these put together should take us to a 1.C world. And how does that happen across? So you know what I'm saying, right? To have kind of a framework that allows for this kind of stock taking and redefining the NDCs going forward, I think will be a interesting and a nice scientific process. I know there's a lot of academic and research literature that kind of sits outside and does do that. And to the extent that this will be a smaller green zone, I suppose there'll be less conversation around that. But adding kind of somewhat more science to this diplomatic process uh, could be an interesting outcome, and I think helpful for folks like us who try and see what is the progress that is being made every year and being able to kind of compare it against national targets, but also against actual progress towards 1.C is kind of is an important tool to have.
Great.
I'm going to be slightly controversial. I'll agree with Kashik, but I think also we really need to see adaptation and resilience still really key. We've seen that progress, and Camilla mentioned earlier that adaptation and resilience is now a global issue. It's not just something that happens over there. And I think progress around that, and that really being, as I was saying earlier, one of the things that does actually help to drive where finance goes, that it's not just all directed to, yes, we've got to keep to 1.5, so let's direct the resources there. The adaptation and resilience come out on an equal footing with mitigation.
And I would say, one, I'd like to see the new finance goal agreed. And I'd like to see it agreed in a way, even if it is not perfect, it's done in a way that countries hold hands and jump, even though they know that they then need to jump further together later down the line. And I think that would be particularly important if we do end up in a Trump 2 scenario, to be able to see that as a sort of signal of the ongoing commitment and the ongoing commitment to multilateralism. The second thing, exactly as Kashik was saying, that momentum and confidence that you can come forward with a good NDC. And that isn't just on the new finance goal, but that's part of it. It's also on all the other market, economic, social, political signals that come through and were refracted through COPs. And I think that's the kind of dynamic that we need to start setting now if we want to set up a good momentum and rhythm going into the COP in Brazil, which, although it won't have a lot to negotiate, it will be quite different. I think will be more of a jamboree like the Dubai COP, and there'll be a lot more kind of political appetite around that to broker different outcomes and moving us, as I said before, from this kind of targets to policy alignment around coal phase out or whatever, to programmatically and economically and in terms of trade, how do we work together to actually do implementation?
Oh, great. Just want to give some time for some audience questions, and then I want to make sure everybody has a moment to give some final thoughts before we close out. But we have a few really great questions here. So from anonymous, all the questions are from anonymous. So, but given the increasing crescendo of conflict globally that expose political and diplomatic divisions, How can we expect to see this play out during the COP process?
I'll jump in. So we might see some attempts to use the process as a kind of proxy for protest and raising that opinion, which is happens and is legitimate, and there are ways of managing that. It's kind of part of the course of countries using different multilateral stages to have a say. I think the other thing is, in general, leaders are very distracted. I think, and so there's less attention. That is the good thing about the COP. It forces leaders to have focus on climate and related topics for a period of time. So I think that's relevant. I think the other way that it will come up is that there is a lot of frustration from developing countries, and you heard that from Lula in the General Assembly last week, that money that is going to various war efforts should actually be being spent on infrastructure investment and transition. So from that perspective, I think it will dig into some of the north-south divides as well, which is sad and problematic, but the world we live in is something we're going to have to try and manage.
Anybody else want to also address this question?
I mean, Camilla, if I can kind of add a note of somewhat positivity and optimism to the COP process, is that even at the height of US-China, the cold conflict and the trade war, and everyone kind of fighting over everyone else's balloons and all sorts of things. The climate diplomacy piece between John Kerry being able to go to China and kind of continue these conversations and negotiations did not die down. So there may be parts of, the leadership agenda, a portfolio that kind of still does move forward, despite the fact that there are issues elsewhere that you kind of conflicted with. And I think the point that you make about this being a low-key COP is super important, because what you might be able to achieve if you did not have the world's cameras all focused on in Baku in November, there may be kind of an opportunity to get something done on something as boring as finding the money to pay for adaptation somewhere in Africa or in the Pacific. And all of those, I think, are kind of opportunities that I would kind of much rather hope happen despite everything else that's happening in the world. As I said, we might not even survive until November if things in the Middle East go to hell, which they seemingly are. But outside of that, this possibly is an opportunity where we can do something quietly on the sidelines without kind of creating too much noise, and hopefully come out better at the end.
Laura, do you want to give your thoughts on this question as well?
So I think my two colleagues answered that very well with the range of views. So I think I don't think I need to add to that.
Okay. I have like kind of an interesting question, especially for, if one's not like in the COP process or paying a lot of attention to it. This is something that I know I was asking myself a lot when I started working in the climate space. But what do you think will be the negotiating priorities of like climate leaders and, like Canada or the US or, the EU as a bloc? And how do you think that, how will that differ from regional blocs and other kinds of interests?
So IID, we support the least developed countries who negotiate as a group in the COP process. And I think what we're hearing from them this year is very much the sort of the commitments around the NQCG, also that things like adaptation, loss and damage, we haven't actually touched on that today, that those are important parts of the agenda. And we have seen at previous COPs particularly the small island states, countries like Maldives, really highlighting the challenges they face, holding cabinet meetings underwater. I think those kinds of things often can, cut through in a big boisterous COP, but actually those messages are still really important, even if it's a much sort of it's much more negotiation focused. And I think those are the things that climate leaders should be paying attention to.
So,
Caustic, yeah.
so at kind of my end, the funny thing is I haven't heard very much. It's almost like what I'm calling these kind of middle big countries aren't really saying very much or kind of focusing as much as they would in a COP conversation in the past. And my theory around this is that this is a COP between the rich countries and the poor countries, and kind of really how this differentiated responsibilities and differentiated impacts can be resolved. With a lot of the countries somewhere in the middle are kind of more focused on using opportunities like New York Climate Week or other forums to be able to kind of reach out to private capital and private finance and kind of showcase their opportunity set. And that's that's kind of interesting point of development in the energy transition space, where I think having a smaller green zone is problematic because you aren't allowing for these off COP discussions and negotiations and deals to happen. But perhaps there are other ways of doing this in today's day and age.
Yeah. Last question from the audience. And this definitely alludes to some of the points that you all raised earlier about, increasing regional ties and different types of multilateralism. Will we see neighboring countries with tensions come together to address climate, especially since some climate events affect them collectively?
So this is where I kind of go completely south and pessimistic, and then kind of South Asia, absolutely not. There is very little opportunity for cooperation or cooperative action, despite the fact that there are so many of these actions that could jointly help alleviate poverty, improve access, address climate issues, and absolutely could have an outsized impact if these countries were to act together. Yeah, you look at what's happening in the Middle East, it seems to be hard to imagine that anything cooperative or joint action on anything would happen. There's the extensive exercises in kind of joint electricity grid that Camilla was talking about earlier could lead to enormous amounts of savings, both in terms of costs as well as in terms of energy use and hence emissions. But is any of that is likely to happen? Not as I see it today.
Camilla or Laura, any thoughts on this question?
I mean, we've just seen the UK and EU meet, and they talked about climate and doing more together on energy. So that's for one. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting one. I think that it does happen, and it has been. I'm not suggesting that it is one that is currently live, sadly. But for example, water has been something that Israel and Palestine have been able to find ways to cooperate on. So I think the reality of that human experience and that shared geography really does matter, and borders ignore that. That we ignore borders when those things happen. So I'm not saying that it's necessarily a good state of affairs, but I do think it's sometimes a kind of hopeful thing that comes out of challenge. And I do hope as well that the sort of industrial and economic opportunities of the transition are something that can increasingly be regionally shared, because there's mutual benefit in having that interconnection. So you've got that flexibility in your grid, et cetera, and yeah, watch this space. New opportunities for cooperation are definitely opening up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd sort of add, Africa has spent a lot of the last sort of 20, 25 years trying to create a common economic market, and it now does have the um, Common Africa Free Trade Area. Interestingly, they didn't mention environment or climate in their initial articles, but that's starting to change. I think that sort of that kind of economic driver that can drive cooperation can also drive the green transition. Back to we've been talking about not necessarily framing it as climate negotiations, but framing it as green inclusive development. So yeah, I think there is definitely scope there.
No, sounds great. I do want to give everyone an opportunity for final thoughts. If there was something that maybe you want to make sure that was said, now's your chance. Let's start with Camilla, then Laura, and then Kaushik.
I'll just say what I normally say, which is that COPs aren't the be all and end all. They are one piece of the puzzle. They are some of the parts of those who turn up at them and represent their interests. But really the battle for interests and choices is made in economies, in societies, and then it is refracted through these COP processes that can be helpful or unhelpful. And it's all about building the momentum and the confidence into them, and the momentum and the confidence out of them.
Yeah, and following on from that, I'd say for successful COPs, breaking down the silos between the discussions on climate finance, development finance, and the institutions that have a role, the IMF, the World Bank, the regional development banks, the UN. So yeah, the sort of the improved collaboration and cooperation to actually help drive through what it is COPs decide.
So hey, I'm kind of optimistic. I think we are making progress. I think we are kind of getting it right eventually, and we are kind of making more progress now than we were making more progress in the past. So there is momentum, and that momentum is only increasing in and outside of COP. And hope to see all of you on the other side.
Well, thank you all for joining us in the audience, but a special thank you to Camilla, Laura, and Kaushik for lending their time and their opinions and their experience on these topics. We talked about all kinds of things, ranging from how topics around climate is really, or conversations around climate are really about conversations of multilateralism. And we saw that kind of play out recently here during UNGA and Climate Week and through the Pact. But there is a benefit to a smaller COP. So I guess we'll just all have to stay tuned and see what happens next. But thank you, everybody, and hope everyone has a great October and I hope we all have an even better November out of the COP29 outcomes. Y'all take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you. Bye-bye.